All right, in this episode, I have an amazing guest I've been following for quite a while now. I've been wanting to get him on the show to talk about race, racism, and how we, how can we hold this conversation that's so important to so many of us? And how can we just be good people out in the world, being considerate of our privilege and our impact? Where the starting line is. Coleman Hughes is my guest, and we get into all of these questions. Coleman is a writer, podcaster, and opinion columnist who specializes in issues related to race, public policy, and applied ethics. Coleman's writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Quillette, the City Journal, and the Spectator. He's appeared on many TV shows and podcasts, including Real Time with Bill Maher, Making Sense with Sam Harris, and the Jordan B. Peterson podcast, and so many more. Impact Theory. I mean, the guy's been kind of everywhere. In June 2019, he testified before U.S. Congress. Born and raised in northern New Jersey, Coleman briefly attended the Juilliard School to study jazz trombone before dropping out to pursue a career as an independent jazz hip-hop artist. Shortly thereafter, Coleman discovered a passion for applied ethics and public policy at Columbia University, where he graduated with a BA in philosophy. And I believe he's 27 years old. Super sharp guy. And also has a couple of amazing hip-hop tunes on his YouTube channel that are very politically charged and thoughtful. This guy is a great thinker. And I wanted to have Coleman on the show because we've had a few conversations about race here. And as a white dude, I'm always trying to learn here in all areas of my life. And how do I feel about the race conversation, and where do I stand, and what do I need to still learn, and how can I just be a better human here? So Coleman is unlike any of the other people we've had on the podcast, is going to bring some pretty controversial opinions and viewpoints that I think are often left out of the race conversation. And I think they're extremely well thought out, and they make sense to me. So I learned a lot in this podcast. I continue to learn from this guy as I listen to him out in the world. And I'm curious what you think and how you will navigate this conversation in yourself. Welcome to the show, Coleman Hughes.
My pleasure.
All right, man. I've been wanting to chat with you for a while. I've been tracking you for over a year now, listening to loads of your viewpoints on race and culture and gender and so many things. And I just really, really appreciate your thoughtfulness and your precision with how you talk about these subjects.
Well, thank you very much for that.
Yeah. So Coleman, how would you introduce yourself? Like if you had 30 seconds to say hello, how do you introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm a guy from New Jersey. I was really a musician for most of my teenage and early adult years. Ended up making a strong pivot when I was about 19. Did a philosophy BA at Columbia and ended up writing for online magazines, largely about the race obsession and craziness that took over American culture starting around 2014, mostly because it was my immediate surrounding. As a Columbia student, I was just encountering a level of obsession about race that I hadn't really encountered before, even growing up in a diverse and liberal town. And I became curious about it. And so I started writing about it for myself, and then eventually writing about it for others. And that set me on a path of appearing on podcasts, writing for various outlets, eventually writing a book that will come out in February. Nice. And starting my own podcast.
Yeah, which is really great. We'll talk about that at the end. I'll guide people there. Yeah. And I've, when just for a little bit of context about what we're going to talk about today, we'll dive into some, obviously some race conversations. As a white male, this conversation is really important to me. I consider myself like a good person. I founded this school that's all about helping people get along better and work through their differences. And that's why I'm on the planet. And when the George Floyd murder happened, like so many other white people, perhaps, I went into a place of, oh shit, I'm not doing enough. And so I started to, I took several courses, mostly DEI style courses. I started following influencers on race and anti-racism. I started ordering books and reading books, and I noticed the tenor of the conversation was very one-sided. And I interviewed several people here on this podcast, actually, also mostly people of color who, I was looking to get guidance from, really. And I hired a private therapist who studies with a well-known thought leader, an anti-racist thought leader, thinking I would really immerse myself. And it just started to feel like I was making some gains, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm trying to, I'd done some work here, but in graduate school, but not a lot. And so I started to really apply myself. And eventually I got to a place of like feeling really disheartened with the whole anti-racist work and wanted another perspective. And then I eventually found you and John McWhorter and Chloe Van Dice and Camille and many of your contemporaries. Valerie, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm curious, what disheartened you about the anti-racism?
Well, I was sort of being told to sit down and be quiet. It's like our turn to talk. It's our turn to have the mic, and you're in a position of power. You don't need the mic more, and you need to, studying a little bit of the book, White Fragility, which you talk a lot about. It's like this concept of original sin. I'm born white and therefore I'm bad and I'm flawed. And there's no way to overcome this in me. I just need to somehow coach it out of me to be more inclusive. And your arguments and your thoughts and perspectives around colorblindness and just your positions have just been refreshing. And I'm not saying I'm on one camp or the other, but I want to continue to broaden my perspective and my ability to hold complexity and hold diversity and hold opposing viewpoints. So I wanted to get your, can you give people just a high level understanding of like, how do you think about race and what's currently missing from the race conversation that you bring?
The way I grew up was based on the philosophy of the civil rights movement, which is, in a word, colorblindness. And now I know people in the DEI anti-racist school that you were just talking about have argued that colorblindness is actually the wrong path. They say that it's really white supremacy in disguise, or that it's a way of ignoring racism. It's a cop-out, etc. I totally disagree. I think really what I mean by colorblindness is just the idea that the fact that you're white and I'm black, ultimately, that doesn't have to have any more meaning than we choose to give it. If we choose to give it meaning, then it has meaning, but that's a choice that we're making either through habit or conscious effort. And we can choose to stop making that choice. And I think that's a much wiser route to go. I mean, we all, maybe not we all, but sometimes I take for granted how growing up in a very multiracial town may have influenced my outlook here. Nevertheless, I don't think you need that lived experience to recognize the truth that you can have the deepest friendships possible with a person of a different race. You can choose to marry a person of a different race and have the closest relationship in your life, cross racial boundaries. So there's no amount of intimacy and closeness that is prevented by belonging to a different race than somebody. And what that tells me is that race is only skin deep. If you go back and look at what Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, and other civil rights heroes were fighting for in the late 50s and early 60s, they were fighting for a society that really embraced legal and political colorblindness, which is to say we are not going to racially discriminate in our laws and our policies for any reason. And we are going to try to embody that ethos of brotherhood and togetherness, right? That, I feel, is the way to combat racism, not the anti-racist DEI philosophy of saying, okay, instead of trying to treat everyone equally, we're actually going to take the playbook of white supremacy and try to reverse it, right? Black people have had to sit down and shut up for several hundred years. So now we're going to give white people a taste of that medicine and see how they like it, right? Mm-hmm. That is, to quote, I think, to bastardize a Nietzsche quote, some people speak of justice, but they mean revenge. Mm-hmm. And the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King was very clear in saying that the point of this is not revenge. He said that many times. And he knew that was an important point to make because he knew some white people would fear that was the case. So at a high level, I feel colorblindness and draining the significance of race is the way to create interracial harmony in the long run.
Yeah, because in my experience, it seems like the anti-racist thing is you're going to another pole, which can separate and create more division.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I read Martin Luther King quite a bit, and I read, Nelson Mandela, and then I read, early founding father. Anyway, his autobiography or his biography was amazing. It'll come to me. And I was so inspired, honestly. I was just like, holy shit, these black men are, the way they're meeting.
Maybe you're thinking of Frederick Douglass?
Yeah, Frederick Douglass, thanks.
Yeah.
The way they're meeting the racism that's occurring in their time is so courageous and so warrior-like and so noble. Mm-hmm. And it feels really different. And I wanted to get your take on, is there a current black thought leader or a person of color thought leader that's living in that way, that's trying to share that message? I mean, I know you're one of many, but someone with massive fame or notoriety, am I missing someone?
No, not really. I mean, the closest we had was early Obama. I think early Barack Obama was deeply versed in the history of great black thought leaders and for the most part hit all the right notes. Later Obama is not quite the same, was more like post 13 when the whole country became swept up in BLM and identity politics. I think as Glenn Lowry points out, Obama had an opportunity to draw the distinction between that and the more inclusive, colorblind, anti-racist tradition of MLK and Frederick Douglass. And I think he failed to do that as much as he should have. Mm-hmm. But early Obama was very close to that. Unfortunately, Black Americans, we used to have really great leaders. We had obviously Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, Bayard Rustin, and having those leaders is a very important part of being able to sort of strategize as a group about how best to move forward. And the set of leaders we have today, if we can even call them leaders, are couldn't really tie the shoes of the leaders that we had in the past, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yo, as you know, I've dedicated my life to helping people with their relationships, right? I want to solve this problem so that all of you can work through your differences and have fulfilling, amazing, badass partnerships and relationships, family, coworkers, friends, whoever. And I have trained a ton of relationship coaches, almost 100 certified relationship coaches, to help you specifically work through your relationship challenges. So I want to invite you to a special deal we're offering to the podcast listener where you can get 50% off your first month of coaching with one of our amazing relationship coaches. Okay, if you're tired of therapy, it feels like that's going around in a circle, or you want to actually set goals and accomplish your relationship goals, hire a relationship coach. Okay, go to relationshipschool.com/get coaching now, and then use the coupon code FIRST50 to get the 50% deal off your first month of relationship coaching. Super psyched to have our amazing coaches serve you and help you get to the next level. You've talked about how social media has really changed the conversation and influenced the conversation in a big way. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So I think many people who are, if you're, say my age or older, I'm 27, you will remember a time when political conversations were had before Facebook, before Twitter, right? Think of 2008 or something. It's not that there was no polarization, but it was way more normal for a Democrat and a Republican to just talk to each other. It was more normal for a Dem and a Republican to get married, right? Yeah. If you did, no one would be like in 2004, oh my God, how do Kathy and Mark stay together when one of them's Democrat, one of them's Republican? You wouldn't be blown away that such a thing could happen. Nowadays, people actually put their politics in their Tinder and Hinge bio so that if you don't have the same politics as them, we don't even have to go on a first date. That's normal now. Yeah. That would have been very strange 20 years ago. So what happened? What happened, in my view, is that, and people like to blame presidents for everything. Oh, Trump, it's all Obama, blah, blah, blah. Right. No, I think what happened is that social media came along and, roughly 2013, 2014, that was the year when not just you, but your mother was on Facebook. And what happened is that the speed of information rapidly went up. It used to be that something might happen in a town in Illinois, and it would be in the local paper the next day, where a journalist would have talked to both parties and talked to the police and is giving you a fairly fact-checked, gate-kept version of what happened yesterday, right? Now what happens in the age of social media and smartphones, that same event can happen in a local town in Illinois. Somebody filmed it on their phone. They filmed a 30-second clip of it that necessarily excludes the beginning of the confrontation, and therefore the context, uploads it to Facebook within minutes, and it has millions of views within a day, shorn of context, and algorithmically boosted to specifically show it to the people that would be most pissed off by whatever is in that video.
Yeah.
So that's how all of the entire news information ecosystem fundamentally changed because of social media and smartphones in a way that no one who created those technologies intended. But the result was that we are all now being fed way more upsetting content, specifically tailored to what would most upset us. And that's given us the impression that all of these problems are so much worse than they are. So, for example, there's Eric Kaufman, who is a political scientist, did surveys, and he found that Black people who are on social media claim to experience more racism in their real lives than Black people who aren't on social media. Now, that's a correlation. It doesn't mean that that's causal. But it is definitely consistent with the story that people who are on social media all the time are seeing an unrealistically bad version of reality that makes them more sensitized to racial slights in the world, where if you just really live in the real world, things are not nearly so bad. And I'll give you one more example. I think it was either in that same study, it was either liberal or very liberal Americans believe that over 1,000 unarmed Black Americans are shot by the police every year. Over 1,000. Now, the real number, a realistic number from any of the past few years might be 15. That's the real number. Mm-hmm. Or thereabouts, right? It may be 12 one year, it may be 20 another year, but that's the real number. So that's how deeply people are deluded by social media, because some would make the argument, okay, well, social media is good because we're just seeing all the racism that was always out there that we didn't see before. Mm-hmm. Well, if that were true, then you would expect us to have a realistic picture. But actually, our picture of racism is totally inflated. So what that suggests to me is that social media is not educating us, it's miseducating us.
Mm-hmm. Completely. Yeah. And isn't it true that more white people are killed? I think you've talked about this, white men in particular are killed every year, or I can't remember the stats on that.
Yeah. So if you talk about unarmed Americans killed, more white unarmed American are killed as a whole number. every year than Black Americans. Now, if you want to do it as a proportion, you'll find Black Americans are more proportionately likely to be killed. But that, that's a longer conversation, and we could talk about that if you want.
Yeah, well, I'm really intrigued. Let me circle back to a couple things. Starting with this question: that is in your opinion, in your experience, has the anti-racist movement made progress, and if so, what are the specifics that you notice?
So, if we're defining anti-racist movement as sort of Black Lives Matter and BLM adjacent, people. The one thing I would really give the movement credit for is that prior to BLM, it was very difficult for a cop to get punished for anything, whether they went berserk and killed a Black kid, a white kid. It doesn't really matter. Prior to 2013, the police unions were so strong that almost any level of abuse would not lead to or would very rarely lead to, say, a criminal sentence for a cop, which was a bad thing, because when there's no checks on power,
right,
human nature takes over.
Yeah,
absolutely. In the BLM era, we have seen an increasing number of cops that are held accountable when they do bad things. So that's a good thing. Besides that, it's difficult for me to think of a single sort of upside to the anti-racist movement, but it's very easy for me to think of large downsides. So just to give one example, the year 2020 was the single greatest year-over-year increase in the murder rate in over 100 years in America. That's according to the Pew Research Center. Now, that didn't happen in any of our peer countries. People like to blame that on the pandemic, which doesn't make sense, because then it would have happened in Canada or the UK and in Australia, and it didn't. It only happened here. So what was the cause? Clearly, the cause was the rioting and protesting and anti-police policies. For instance, defund the police, which shrank the police force in many cities. 911 calls took much longer to be responded to. The police were in general demoralized, and there was mass retirements. The shrinking and defanging of the police led to an increase in murder, homicide, and crime. And that increase, historic in American history, was not born equally by different races. It was highly concentrated within the Black community. So there was just, perhaps, in this low thousands of excess deaths that happened because of the highly charged rhetoric and policy towards police that occurred in 2020. That, I think, is a direct result of the unhinged and irrational nature of the anti-racist movement, which made the police issue all about race when it was not all about race. And that strikes people who hear it for the first time as, this guy must be crazy. What is he talking about? Every example of an unarmed Black person I know of was an unarmed American killed by the cops is Black. What are you telling me? That's some kind of coincidence? Well, no, you've only heard about the ones that are Black because those are the only cases that get to the mainstream media. Mm-hmm. There are countless, in fact, more every year, unarmed white people that get killed by the cops than unarmed Black people. You just don't hear about them because it stays local news. Right. Look up the video of Tony Timpa, who was a white guy killed in a very similar way to George Floyd in Dallas. Look up Daniel Shaver. There are many, many examples I could give, and I list many more in my book. This was an issue of police accountability primarily. It's not to say racism isn't real. There is real racism as well. But primarily, this is an issue of police accountability that was framed as a racial issue, which led to riots and protests and aggressive anti-police policies that ended up hurting the Black community most. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So intense. Now, we can easily make the argument that there's clearly racism still going on everywhere in this country, right? That, like, I imagine when I walk into a store, it's different than when a Black person walks into a store, and depending on what the store is and who the store owner is, I can imagine that there's just ways in which, when I understand a person of color's experience and what it's like to not feel safe many days for a particular person, and I know that's not everyone's experience, but I've talked to plenty of people of color where the experience is, it's not safe. There's no, quote, safe spaces for me. So how do I advocate for myself? So how do you, I'm assuming, because I've heard you acknowledge there clearly is racism. Mm-hmm. And it's all about how it gets, I guess, dealt with. And what advice do you have for people who are like, well, let's at least say that this is occurring. There's clearly racism, and then how do we deal with it?
Yeah, no, this is it's a very delicate question. I mean, the first thing I would say is I try to be as realistic as possible about racism. And what that means to me is that to a degree, you can shame people and wag your finger and tell them don't be racist, and that works a bit up to a point. I think as a society, America has maxed out on the gains from that strategy. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's going to be more additional decreases in people's inner racism as a result of shaming. I think we've done more of that than possibly any society in history has done. And a lot of the racism that remains is a result of people making generalizations based on their actual experience. If I lived in Harlem for 4 years. If I go up to a Yemeni deli shop there, and I ask the Yemeni off the record, who are your biggest problem clients that are stealing from your store? He's going to tell me, 8 out of 10 are Black. And that's the source of his prejudice, right? He doesn't have any white guilt. He may not know about, and certainly probably doesn't care about, the history of slavery and Jim Crow. All he knows is that the people that are a problem for him are the Black people. And that's where he gets his, and then he starts to generalize about the whole group. And so what is the solution in that particular case? Is it shaming the Yemeni deli owner, or is it actually trying to address the root cause, which is, the problem of crime in that case? And I know if I talk to Black people who lived in New York before I was born, say in the 80s and the early 90s, famously, you could not get a cab as a Black person. A lot of the cabs would just pass you, right? And I talked to Neil deGrasse Tyson on my podcast, who's old enough and a New Yorker to remember. He says that problem was horrible in the 80s and 90s. By the 2000s and by the 2010s, it had gotten quite a bit better. Now, why did that happen? One theory would be somehow cab drivers magically got nicer and less racist, or they all read, Robin DiAngelo or something. No, I think crime in the city came way down. Right. From its height in the early 90s. So
that was Giuliani's thing, right?
Exactly. The city absolutely transformed. And so in the case of New York and cab drivers and many analogous cases, the realistic, hard-nosed way to decrease racism is to address the underlying problems that are causing people to behave in racist ways. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, completely. Which we could get into parenting, single home families. We could get into poverty and class, and there's a lot of possibilities there. Where do you steer? Where do you point this sort of arrow in what direction when you look at, okay, what is this root cause here? Some of these problems.
Yeah, well, parenting is tricky because, the government can't really reach into the home and in that way. And parental investment is so important, but it's in some ways outside the direct reach of the state. What the state can do is to make K through 12 schooling as good as it can possibly be. So I think some of the best research on this has been done by Roland Fryer, who is an economist at Harvard and who himself grew up in the hood. And he told me on his podcast, he learned to count by counting money from his cousins who were selling crack. And that's the background he came from. And he rose to become a Bates Medal winning economist and has done really interesting, hard-nosed empirical research about what works for poor kids, and especially poor kids of color. So he took 16 schools in the Houston public school system and got unprecedented carte blanche to do whatever he wanted to half of them. So he randomized it, picked half of them, fired half the teachers, fired all the principals, replaced them with better people, lengthened school hours, gave every student his or her own tutor, increased the number of tests, and then the tutors would individualize their tutoring based on the results of the last test, and instituted what he called a culture of high expectations, which is, high discipline, high expectations. If you break the rules, you're getting, you're suffering the consequences, right? Not like a lenient culture. Particularly important for poor kids that have an unstructured, chaotic household. If you come from a wealthy family, if you come from two-parent home, in some ways you can afford to go into a more relaxed school environment because you have so much structure at home. If you have no structure at home and you have no structure at school, you're basically on your own.
Yeah.
So he does this, and he's able to raise math scores by 0.1 standard deviations, which is a very good intervention for this kind of research. For Hispanic kids, it was twice as high, and it was even higher for the poor kids and the younger kids. So instituting something like this, this is why I think school choice is a very important issue. Unfortunately, public schools, as important as they are, and as much as I admire all the people trying to fix them, there's so many rules and regulations with regard to the teachers' unions and what you can and can't do. So, for example, the intervention Fryer did in Houston's public schools, you couldn't do that at a school. You can't just fire half the teachers. You can't you can't just fire the principal, etc. So school choice, supporting those charter schools which are doing well, not all of them are doing well, but the ones that are, expanding access to those, creating some more competition among schools for students rather than having a government monopoly on it. That's all very important.
Yeah, great. Hey, if you want to up-level your life, your relationship life specifically, I want you to consider our Relationship Mastery program. It's 9 months of complete transformation where you become a better listener, a better communicator, you learn how to have secure relationships, and you get an experiential taste of that. You feel seen and supported and challenged to reach your relationship goals. And really, you become a better communicator. So many people have gone through this course now. And we have a done with you version of it now, which is amazing, where you get assigned a private relationship coach. You get to do live group coaching with me once a month and ask me anything you want. There's office hours where you get to meet with one of our coaches to nerd out on the curriculum. And the community is very strong. And these are people who care a lot about relationships, and they want to get what they want to get, which is they want to be in a relationship and not betray themselves, right? They want to get the relationship they want while being true to themselves. That's what most of us want. And this course is the path for you to get that. Here's what one of our participants in the past has said about this course.
What I would say to people that have been listening to the podcast but aren't ready to take that final step into joining the course, the most powerful thing has been like the partner calls. The accountability is something that you're not going to get by just listening to podcasts on your own. Because I thought the same thing, like, I'm getting a lot out of just listening to these podcasts, and I'm, been in therapy, I've, done this and that. To take that deeper dive and the commitment, there's something about just the financial commitment, the time and the energy that you put into it. What you put in is what you're going to get out of it. And so, again, if, invest in yourself.
All right. Amazing words from one of our heartfelt students here at the Relationship School. If you want to change your life like they did, go to relationshipschool.com/relationship mastery. and we'll see you in there. Man, I have so many other questions diverging, and then we could go deeper with each one of these things you're talking about here. Will you speak to, I think it was you and I listened to an interview with you and John Wood Jr. It might have been that one or a different one, but talking about tribalism. And David Brooks writes about tribalism versus relationalism. Relationalism being like, no, we actually live in community together, so we need to find a way to figure this out. Tribalism is, I go to my camp. I mean, obviously, you know what tribalism is, but for the listener, it's like, I go to my camp, my DEI camp, or my left camp, or my right camp, or whatever the camp I'm in, and I fuse with these people, and we're against someone. And that's like community. And it seems like there's a lot of that going on right now. I'm curious your thoughts on tribalism versus like a relationalism.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first time I'm hearing of that term, relationalism. In general, tribalism is a part of human nature. We are definitely hardwired by our evolutionary past to bind together in a tribe and to view our tribe as in some way superior, to get warm feelings when we help someone from our tribe, and to be irrationally sort of hateful of another tribe. Yeah. And I think one way we feel this in the modern day is just, if you're really passionate about your local sports team, that feeling that you get when you're at the home game, you're against the rival team, and it's like, and say you lose the game and you walk out and you see the Boston Red Sox cap on another guy, and you're just like, fuck that guy. Right? Like that feeling, that's what tribalism is. That's what we're hardwired for. And it's why we enjoy sports so much. So that's a problem, because that feeling taken to its logical conclusion is what creates riots and pogroms and wars and inter-ethnic violence and genocide. And discrimination, regimes of discrimination, like Jim Crow. So the question is, given that this is a part of our human nature, how do we combat and tamp down on the bad elements of that? Right.
Yeah.
And I think one thing to note is that just because we have a tribal nature, it doesn't mean that race has to be the dividing line of the tribe. Right. The dividing line of the tribe could be, Americans versus, say, Russians, as it was during the Cold War. And I think, people old enough to remember will know that, like, after moments like 9/11, and somehow you can feel your tribe kind of changing, right?
Yeah.
You can feel that it's now America versus our enemies, as opposed to white people versus black people. And so it can be quite malleable. But I think that the deeper point is that we want to use our conversations, our art, our writing, all of the elements of our cultural software to tamp down on the negative elements of tribalism. So I'll give a concrete example. Constantly bringing up another person's race as something that is a deficit, I think is the exact opposite of what I'm saying we should do. That is amplifying tribalism. It's making people think of themselves as a raced person more often. And an simple example I'll give of this is the constant talk of white privilege, right? If you're going to bring up someone's white privilege every time you are having a conversation and deepen their sense of attachment to their, quote, white identity, that is exactly the kind of talk that would increase tribalism rather than decrease it.
Yeah. Now,
that doesn't mean you can't acknowledge how your race may have helped you in a particular situation. But there is a fine and important line between having an honest conversation about who has experienced different kinds of luck and privilege in life, and there are many of them. Race is certainly not the only one. And and zeroing in on one aspect of a person's identity, right? Like we could have been having a whole conversation about like height privilege, right? And just making it this weird dividing thing
Size
between
privilege.
short people, shorter people and taller people.
Mm-hmm.
And that could even have some scientific backing. I'm sure people do get treated differently in subconscious ways based on a million different variables. Race is just one of them. But what would the effect of that overall be, right? Would that have the effect of bringing short and tall people more together, or would it create a lot of resentment?
Mm-hmm.
It would like nurse the sense of grievance that short people feel at tall people, and a lot of tall people be like, "Fuck you! It's not my fault I was born tall. Stop! Why are you?
Right.
Why are we zeroing in on this thing?"
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we've seen along the lines of race. I think it's possible to fight real racism, as was done during the civil rights movement, without making it, without zeroing in on the identities of white people and all this talk of white this, white that.
Yeah.
So that's my general approach.
Yeah, totally. I find that when I introduce myself as a white heterosexual male, it's very disarming for some people, and it's very maybe annoying for others. And I know that again, that my race or my whiteness, I have certain advantages, as the classic teaching in the DEI work is like my starting line is farther along, right, than say a person of colors. And I think there's personally a lot of validity and merit to that. And it feels important to me to acknowledge that. But I'm curious what you would say to that. And, so that's one question. And the other one I have to frame a little contextually is, I'm taught, white people are definitely taught in the anti-racist work that, look, you don't want to ask a black person or a woman or a disabled person to speak for all colored people or disabled people. And I get that. It can be like annoying. And so I do that because I want information at times, but so it's like asking you, Coleman, what advice do you have for white people? Not that you're speaking for all people of color, but how do we, if a listener's white listening to this, how do they navigate these conversations and the acknowledgement that there is actually racism going on?
Yeah. Okay. So taking that question first, my advice for white people is to don't take advice from anyone that's giving advice to white people. Like, white people are just people. Black people are just people. I think the advice that would apply to one would apply to the other, in terms of always hear people out, give your perspective, question your own assumptions, and question your conversation partner's assumptions. Assume good faith until it's proven otherwise. And, like that would be my advice for everyone. I frankly, I feel like, giving advice to one race of people that doesn't apply to the other is itself a little strange. And so ultimately my advice for everyone is to understand, yes, we all have our cultural attachments. We're all born in a specific place. We grew up with a specific kind of food, specific kind of music, specific language or dialect, specific values. And we can have all of our attachments to that. That's beautiful. And that's a lot of the beauty of life, is being attached to the particular. But when we come into the realm of, how we should behave, what are the right ethics for society? What are the right politics for society? I think there is a way in which we have to leave our particular attachments at the door and embrace the notion of a human family where everyone is equal, and one person, one vote, and nobody gets precedence above anyone else in the conversation, and no one is told to sit down and be quiet, and we all can operate on a footing, on an equal footing. As for the first question, like, should you introduce yourself as like a white heterosexual man, and should you sort of acknowledge that you had a better starting line, I have no problem with anyone acknowledging the realities of their own privilege, whether that be race privilege, class privilege, etc. What bothers me is that this seems to be very one-sided. So, for example, no one would ever expect a Black person to acknowledge the advantage of, say, applying to college under race-based affirmative action or getting a job under an aggressive diversity program, where they may have gotten a job like more easily than a similarly qualified Asian or white applicant. No one would say, well, as a Black person, you really have to acknowledge that instance was, in that moment, it was better to be Black than to be white. Mm-hmm. And so, like I said, I have no problem anyone acknowledging reality. I do think that we can't, as Black people, we can't demand that white people acknowledge every jot and tittle of how it may be better to be white in certain situations, and then abandon our side of that equation and say, well, there's actually no situations ever where it's better to be Black.
Yeah.
Which is just not true in my view.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. That's a refreshing take. I imagine some listeners are going to feel a little relieved, because I think what the anti-racist movement has done for some white people is it's made us very scared and uptight and careful and confused and like shameful, and the list goes on.
Yeah.
I'm doing it wrong.
Totally.
Quote, wrong. Hey, quick interruption here. Imagine a career that draws on your passion for personal growth and relationships, that harnesses your ability to support, challenge, and connect with others, that helps you develop as a person while you help others at the same time. What if you could earn a living while making an impact on thousands of people's lives, and even on the future of society and how we treat each other? It'd be pretty cool, right? Well, that job does exist. It's the job of a relationship coach, and I believe that the relationship coaches in the world are going to play a crucial role in the future of our culture, not only in the US, but abroad. 1 in 2 marriages still ends in divorce. 3 out of 5 Americans are lonely. We've got a serious loneliness epidemic and a looming mental health crisis that's, I think, already here. Couples that do well live 10 years longer than couples that don't. Okay. According to the Gottmans, 80% of couples are headed in the direction of divorce within their first 4 to 5 years of marriage. Yikes. Okay. Relationship stress is chronic disease. It creates chronic disease, in my opinion, from what I've read and the research I understand. I think it really hurts people everywhere. And I think the only way to really address this you could say relationship crisis, really, because it looks like a mental health crisis. It looks like a loneliness crisis. But we have to ask why. What is the root of this? Well, possibly how we raise kids. Possibly it's how we treat each other in our intimate, closest relationships. And the bottom line here is that people need help. They need your help. And our relationship coaches are slowly growing their businesses and doing well and feeling fulfilled and like they have a meaningful purpose and career where they get to work for themselves. So if you want to come be a part of this amazing training, you can apply right now. We're taking applications. That's open currently, and go to relationshipschool.com/RCT if you want to apply and get an interview. We do offer a portion of scholarships to people that enroll if money is an issue, and it's a big investment. But if you think of the return on the investment, what you get out of this training, you are going to transform as a person, as an individual, and you're going to become a better partner, better parent, etc. And you're going to learn how to effectively help people with their relationship challenges, thus leading to less loneliness, perhaps, and less mental health challenges for people out there. Okay. So come apply for our amazing training, relationshipschool.com/RCT. You mentioned affirmative action. Quick thoughts on that with a recent decision?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I see a lot of people sort of hyperventilating and freaking out about this decision, I think there's two things to say to that right off the bat. One is affirmative action was already illegal in 9 different states before this ruling, including the largest state, California. And those places were still perfectly fine places to go to college as a Black or Hispanic student. And I didn't hear anyone really freaking out about that before. So secondly, affirmative action only affects, this is according to Princeton sociologist Thomas Espenshade's estimate, only affects 1% of Black and Hispanic 18-year-olds in any given year. Because 99% of Black and Hispanic kids, they either don't graduate high school or they do graduate high school and go to a college that has a high acceptance rate, like most colleges do. Most state schools, most colleges that Americans attend have acceptance rates between like 60% and 95%. Those kinds of schools don't practice affirmative action to begin with. The only schools that this affects are schools like the ones I went to, like Columbia and the other Ivy Leagues and some elite schools that aren't Ivies. This is a policy that has nothing to do with addressing poverty or access to higher education. It's a policy that has to do with making it somewhat easier for the top 1% of Black and Hispanic elites to get into the very, very top schools at the expense of, to an extent, white students and to a greater extent, Asian students. I don't think it has nothing to do with redressing past racism. It's just a policy that has unfairly discriminated against lots of kids in the name of addressing issues that it doesn't even address to begin with. So I think this is a good decision.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks. Starting to wrap up here. Do you feel like, what I noticed about human beings over the last couple decades of working with people directly, is there some folks, and I don't know if this applies to race, I imagine it does, but it applies to kind of every group of people, if we were to lump people in groups, is there's some people in every group, in every family, in every culture that are able to somehow rise above whatever their challenges are. And there's some people that can't. And there's some people that take responsibility, and there's some people that blame. We could use the word victim here. And I'm curious, do you notice that it doesn't matter what your color of skin is, or where your stance is in line, or how much privilege you have or don't have? There's people who just don't want to change and don't want to apply themselves and don't want to do anything different in their lives.
Totally. That's what I've noticed in my life is like, I'll meet people from the least possible privilege and the most possible privilege, and they'll both have every permutation of outlook. Like, you'll have people that just, no matter how much shit they've gone through in their life, they're just always positive. They're always, on the level and trying to do their best and never blaming the world. Then you'll meet people that come from the most privilege possible, that are just only ever looking at the tiny things in their life that could have been better, right? Like, you'll meet someone who comes from money, had 2 parents in the home, first of all, grew up in America, which is like automatically puts you in the top 1% of the world. Mm-hmm. Just like literally is sitting on a mountain of good luck, and is like focused on the one way in which they were somewhat less lucky than some other people on the top of that mountain. And that little thing will basically consume all their attention, and they're just not paying attention to the mountain of good luck that they have in life.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, I don't know where these attitudes come from, whether it's how you were raised or what your genetic set points are, but I see very little correlation between a person's actual objective situation in life and how they view their own life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some other time, I'd love to get into developmental theory and Ken Wilber. Have you studied Ken Wilber at all?
Not at all.
Really? Oh, dude, you're a philosopher guy. You got to check him out. In terms of his developmental stages, because people, in short, it's stages of consciousness. And if I am at a lower stage of consciousness, I can't see obviously to higher stages. And I believe the world is black and white and this or that. And as I develop myself and my consciousness, I can start to see more and hold more complexity. Anyway, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Coleman, this has been great, man. I have more questions for you, but perhaps another time. Congrats on the book coming out.
Thanks so much. Happy
to support you if you'd be open to it when that comes out here.
Absolutely.
And final two questions. We always ask all our guests the same question. If you had a room full of 1,000 high school students, you could only teach them one thing about relationships, what would you say to them?
Room full of 1,000 high school students, and I can only teach them one thing about relationships. Oof. That's a tough one. Do you have an answer to that?
I'd say find the people that are willing to be authentic and nurture those relationships.
Yeah, what I would say is it's not automatic. If you don't feed it, it will die. The relationship, the friendship is not automatic. I would especially tell high school students that, because high school is an artificial setting where you see your friends every day. And so you can think, by doing nothing, my friendships maintain. Mm-hmm. What you learn as you get older is that actually high school is the exception and real life is the rule, where you have to create the situations to hang out and the phone calls and all the rest, or else the friendship will just disappear.
Yeah. Cool. Last question is, where can people find you and listen to your podcast and look out for your book?
My podcast is called Conversations with Coleman, which you can listen to wherever you listen to podcasts. My book will be coming out in February, called The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America. You can also follow me on Twitter at Coldxman, COLDXMAN.
Okay. And I highly recommend that. He's full of goods here. And his podcast is awesome. So thanks, Coleman. Really appreciate what you're up to in the world, and you're just bringing what you care about out there. Thank you.
Thank you.